Lovely stuff. So as the name very much says, my name is Dr. Kaja Franck. I don't really care how you pronounce it, and you can find my email address and my Twitter there. So this particular talk is a revisiting of a talk that I gave at the International Gothic Association, I think 2 years ago. I don't really know what time it is. And I'm going to be really honest and say that this is a talk that I have found rewarding and frustrating in equal measures, and it sort of ends just quite abruptly because I really feel like there's a lot here, but I'm still at that point of like unpacking what is here. I had to stop myself from it suddenly becoming a talk about Howling 3, but there is now a talk about Howling 3 in the back of my mind, which is quite cool since it has an actual werewolf on doing ballet on a stage. So please bear with me. There'll be quite a bit of jumping about. I'm going to try and bring in some context as well. But yeah, I am conscious that it's a chewy talk at the moment. So it's called Shifting Perspectives, Animality as Gothic Interruption in Ballet de la Nuit and Dracula. And the first one that I want to talk about is Ballet de la Nuit. So as I was preparing for the original talk, I was really interested to think about, do you see werewolves doing ballet? Do you see animals doing ballet? Do you see animals doing modern dance, or any kind of dance that we might associate with what might be conceived of high culture, the kind of dance that we associate with the notion of control and civility. These are themes that I know both Kate and Karen are going to talk about, particularly about the embodied control of performing, in particular, ballet. And if so, what do you do when you have a monster or animal or a creature who perhaps defies the notion of what dance is and that idea of control on stage? And what I came across is the Ballet de la Nuit. And Jean Leray writes the following description of it. He says, "You'd never seen the like of it before. The heavens, sea and earth, games, mirth, peace and war, now an attack, now rough combat, witches attending a Sabbath, werewolves, dragons and monsters, gallants, gossips, goddesses, blacksmiths, Christians and Turks, thieves, a fair, a fire, a fair, a ball, a ballet, a play. One saw such enchantments." So the picture here is Louis XIV in his costume. He performs in the Ballet de la Nuit. I'll give more explanation of it. He performs in the Ballet de la Nuit, and he performs as Apollo the Sun God, appropriately enough. Now, what perhaps interested me here was this notion that there was given that this is a play that's performed in 1653, and we know it wouldn't have been that long ago, or even concurrently, people were concerned with things like the existence of witches and werewolves and vampires, etc., etc. It's very clear here that this is a case where it's a sense that these can be enjoyed, the depiction of werewolves, dragons and monsters, witches, can be enjoyed as purely entertainment, as spectacle, that there is some separation, and there's a sense that this is a controlled way of engaging with the supernatural. And so that was sort of where I wanted to go with that notion of control and animality on the stage. I'll tell you a little bit about the Ballet de la Nuit. It's a ballet de corps, which just translates as court ballet. I'm going to do some terrible French pronunciation throughout this, and I do apologize. And a court ballet is kind of the precursor of what we understand ballet to be. So it does have things like technical rules in terms of performance and in terms of dance. And this in particular is laid down by a gentleman called Beauchamp. He doesn't seem to have another name, at the Royal Academy. It's associated, of course, with French courts, hence a lot of the languages in French. And we really see it coming around in the late 1500s in the court of Catherine de' Medici. It becomes increasingly more lavish under Louis the 13th, and then essentially we get this almost apotheosis with Ballet de la Nuit. The Ballet de la Nuit is first performed in 1653 in, as I said, the court of Louis XIV, and it's meant to cover a 12-hour period, basically the 12 hours of night, hence the name. it translates as the ballet of the night. So officially going from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And in that time, there are 4 watches. And so they're meant to cover the 3-hour periods, and different things happen. So early on, people are going, you see the dancers doing things that you might do in the early evening. And then as it goes further through, we start having these supernatural elements appearing on stage. And as with all ballet de corps, you would have included members of the court. So you would have had faces known at court performing as different characters. Now, the ballet de corps is typically associated with a show of power from the monarch, because it's expensive, because there is intimately a notion of control in that the ballet performers have to be controlled in their movement, but also in terms of things like asking members of the court to take part. And it can be seen as an act of supplication, and it has been read as an act of supplication in which you perform for the monarch, and you sort of just have to play the role that you have been given, quite literally. However, I think Jennifer Thorpe kind of challenges that and does something that I think is particularly interesting when we think about ideas of power. And I want to come back to throughout this paper when we're thinking about when we allow monsters and monstrous animality and hybridity and werewolves and vampires on stage. So she says, it has often been claimed that the Ballet de la Nuit celebrated Louis XIV's coming of age and the reassertion of royal authority after the defeat of the Fronde, which was an uprising. Thus, the ballet was a glorification of a young king who saved France from civil war. But that argument has been challenged, for even in 1653, there was still a strong threat of civil unrest from those sympathetic to the Fronde. So as Thorpe identifies, even the very act of drawing attention to authority and power, you are also drawing attention to the flip side of that, which is that authority can be challenged, that will probably always be ongoing threats to that power. And indeed, one could argue, since we are talking about an actual performance, that it draws attention to the notion that the very concept of power, particularly when we think about royal power or the monarch, is a performance itself. It has pomp and circumstance, it has ritual, it has nice outfits, and it has set movements and acts that you need to do, much as you would find in a ballet. I want to sort of like talk now a little bit about how that notion of control is also associated with the act of viewing. You may be aware that during the 1500s and the 1600s, in courtly behaviour, and I'm thinking here particularly England and France and Germany, sort of Western Europe, where I'm more familiar culturally, that going to court was about seeing and being seen, and that you were almost continually on show. And that was much reiterated in the Ballet de la Nuit and Ballet de Corps more broadly when we look at the place that it would have been performed. Now, I should say here that my background has also been working at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre as a tour guide. So when I saw this picture, although it is clearly set in France, the first thing, and the French court, the first thing I thought was, oh, that's an indoor Jacobean theatre. And it kind of is. There's a certain continuity and overlap and sort of informing one another when it comes to the construction of court spaces at this period of time between the various European powers. And what we have here is a hall. At one end is obviously sort of a backdrop there, and that was reasonably normal, quite typical in your hall, regardless of if there was a performance on or not. You would have sort of a wooden covering where people could bring food out and to hide some of the things that were going on. But otherwise, we have this galleried performance space in which it's kind of a thrust stage. There is no proscenium arch to create a sense of the fourth wall between the actors and between those who are in the audience, which I often think typically almost reasserts a power on behalf of the performers. Instead, here that is completely broken. The light would have been shared, so there's no spotlight to change that power dynamic further. And people would have been quite literally looking at the performers. So it's quite a vulnerable space where you're being regarded from all sides. In that way, then it almost has, I would argue, kind of like a zoo-like quality, which I'll discuss on the next slide. And I think I want to draw attention to this notion of things being brought in as spectacle when we look at the fact that there are trees on stage in this picture. So the trees are being brought in as an image of nature, as a set piece, but again, as a notion almost of control of the natural world. So what about French werewolves and monstrous wolves? Well, if you know your French history, or indeed you know most of your history about Europe, from about 1200s onwards, like sheep were the most important thing in terms of the economy, and wolves eat sheep. And even today, there's tension between shepherds and wolf populations. But this is made more extreme when your livelihood is really absolutely connected to sheep, and indeed the livelihood of most of the people in your country. We see a number of werewolf trials. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with that notion, but it literally is people who were put on trial for the crime of being a werewolf. And I've listed a few there that you can see. And then I've also put the Le Bête de Gévaudan, or the Beast of Gévaudan, on there as an interesting sort of post case after the werewolves, where this is a preternatural wolf rather than a werewolf. There are some overlaps, but generally people tend to think of it as like a wolf that's kind of unnatural. I've also got alongside here a picture of the costume that would have been worn by the person portraying the dancer portraying the werewolf, and the costume designer was Henri de Guisset, you can see there. In this case, it looks as though it is a man on the front and a wolf on the back. And so there's a notion of almost surprise, the unexpected. You see someone who looks civilized, a dancer like all the others, beautifully dressed, and then voila, it's actually a wolf on the back. I also think what's quite interesting is that wolf looks kind of dead and passive, as though it has been sort of killed and taken control of. And I couldn't find any evidence that they would have used actual wolf pelts. It's not beyond possibility there were royal wolf hunters at this time. But certainly I think it's interesting that it looks like it is the man who is controlled and who is controlling the wolfish aspect. So in that way, the danger of the werewolf and the violence of the werewolf that might have been expressed in the fear around the werewolf trials is, much like the trees in the in the court for the performance, kind of like undermined in many ways. And so this potential sort of Gothic interruption is perhaps, it has the wind taken out of it. Despite this, the libretto, so there would have been spoken word alongside to give you context what was happening in each scene. So this libretto was written by Isaac de Bonsegaard. The libretto does suggest that the supernatural elements that we see, the witches and the werewolves, are meant to, in some way, show the potential threat of the Fronde. They act symbolically as this disorder, this unrest, this lack of civility. And then, yes, they saw this potential threat, and then Apollo, the Sun King, comes and gets rid of it. But I do think when I look at that picture, it seems like it's already gone. Interestingly, Sabine Baring-Gould, and obviously take what he says with a pinch of salt, suggested that Jean, of Jean Ronier, the werewolf, had said that he had the wolf skin in his possession, and that he went out hunting for children at the command of his master, the Lord of the Forest, Satan. So he put on the wolf skin in order to become wolf. And there is therefore that notion, intimately even in the werewolf trials, of this idea of like performance, putting on the skin. And in Jean Renier's case, he genuinely believed he became animal through this performance. So there does seem to be a potential there of that notion that perhaps one could truly become animal just through performing animal. I'm going to do this really briefly, but I just think it's really interesting. And I apparently have some obsession with gardens at stately homes. I'm really interested in terms of like artistic production and garden design. I never knew I was, but I find this more and more. So I talked about this notion of the control of nature, of bringing both monstrous nature in the form of werewolves and then bringing the trees inside and making it a part of the spectacle, something that was controlled, performed, almost supplicating itself for the court. And I think you can see that kind of mirrored in the very design of Versailles itself, where the natural world is ordered into these geometric these geometric patterns that the monarch can enjoy. And indeed, the dancers in ballet de corps would have done a lot of geometric patterns because they were being looked at often from above, from that galleried perspective. So again, there's this overlap there. Moreover, Louis XIV is generally held up as being, an animal lover by the standards of the time. And he was really involved in building upon the menagerie at the Palace of Versailles. And I've got a picture there. And what you should note about it is it's got this central building where the monarch could go to look upon the animals. So the animals were kind of always there to be viewed. And again, I'm drawing on Michel Foucault's work on panopticon and menageries, etc., but we do not have enough time for an aside into Michel Foucault. And so the animals were there to be viewed by the monarch. And again, it's that reassertion and that notion of power through spectacle and performance. Of course, you can argue that in the menagerie, the animals aren't aware that they are part of a performance. But I'm always up for complicating that notion that animals are somehow sort of like just passive objects that have no awareness of what's happening. And this also brings in the idea of, in this Gothic interruption of animality in Ballet de la Nuit in the form of the werewolf and the monstrosity of animality, is there a chance for us to maybe kind of reclaim power on behalf of the animal? Ellen R. Welsh's discussion of the fictions of courtly self and how human performers, members of the court, balance that idea that they were in some ways supplicating themselves and prostrating themselves to the monarch through their performance. She sort of talks about how you can balance that with their ability to bring back their own autonomy. I think that kind of brings in a notion that perhaps we could apply, and we will be applying as we look further at how dancers embody animality on stage. She says that ballet gives material form to the nexus of relationships comprising court society and highlights the mutual interdependence of these roles. And I'm interested because she takes, and again, I'm really conscious that this is well outside of my realm of literary studies, but she talks a lot about the idea of embodied practice. And that to simply look at ballet or any kind of dance performance, or indeed any performance, simply as the thing that you are viewing, takes away the idea that there is the performer behind there. And I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about and unpacking the relationship between depictions of animality on stage and indeed the relationship between the human and the animal more broadly. Just as I would argue that the animals in menagerie are themselves still individuals and still have a certain amount of autonomy even within that control, I think the very fact that there's a menagerie, the very fact that there's werewolves on stage, shows that humans are conscious of that mutual interdependence of those roles, that we need animality, that we need animals in some ways to define ourselves, but also because it continues to challenge our notion of identity. We're going to jump forward now to another sort of time of power and empire. We're going to go to Victorian Britain. I've got a picture here of the Prince of Wales at the zoo from 1874, I think. I can't see the number very well. And there he is going to look at exotic animals from across the empire as sort of a show, as it was, of power. Look at all the animals that we have. And zoological gardens really sort of become increasingly popular at this point. And this is really maybe when we find sort of the foundations of the zoo as we understand it again. However, just as Jennifer Thorpe drew attention to that notion that in performing power, you are also drawing attention to the fault lines of power, so too the power over animals and the spectacle of animals in zoos was troubled by the increasing awareness of Darwinism. So these clear dividing lines, sometimes in the form of, having cages and so forth, and in the form of humans versus animals, was being challenged by the increasing awareness of evolution. Something which certainly goes on to inform Bram Stoker's Dracula. And if you've noticed I'm jumping about a lot, yes, I am. This is how my brain works at the moment. And I think there's something here. So if you've got any questions, any comments, I would love them. I'm really interested in this, but I'm just grappling with where I want to go with it. So Dracula has lots of moments in which the titular count suddenly transforms into an animal, ultimately proving fears of degeneration, of the worst possible implications of Darwinism, that humans could suddenly become uncivilized. And he notably turns into a wolf, and so sort of reiterates the fears around the lack of civility that werewolves seem to imply, as you become this monstrous, hungry, wolfish animal. But it's actually this moment where Dracula crawls out of the window as a disgusted Harker looks on that I want to talk about now. That is the moment, really, quite early on, where Harker asks, "What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man?" Dracula seems to be at once more than human, less than human. And just as Jean Renier said that he was a werewolf when he put on the skin of the wolf, it seems that Dracula is a non-human wearing the skin of the human. And when those fault lines become apparent, Harker is drawn into an act, feels repulsed and terrified by it. The language itself portrays that animal-like quality. We have crawled down, we have the notion of going face down with his cloak spreading out around him, and he moves just as a lizard. At the same time, though, I think the word terror also suggests the potential pleasure of this spectacle, although incredibly repressed, because Jonathan Harker doesn't seem to realise that he's in a queer narrative, bless him. And so he does seem to notice things like the movement of his back and arms and his fingers and toes. So this physicality where he seems to be locating this animality, sort of like, what is it that tangibly makes us human physically? In adaptations of Dracula, both the Northern Ballets and Mark Bruce's company, and just to say, Mark Bruce is modern dance. It's not purely ballet. We see this scene done, so it's performed. I'm going to show you a clip from Northern Ballet where that scene is shown. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any video of Dracula crawling down in the Mark Bruce company, so I've got two quotations that should show you that, you know, it wasn't just my imagination, it did actually happen. I wasn't hallucinating. So I'm going to show this first clip. I will zoom ahead and I'll show it. There we are, it's only a couple of seconds. There you are, and I will do it again, just so that you can see it again. There you are. So you can see he's crawling head down. And as Strange and Complex sort of says about the Mark Bruce performance, and again, it's interesting that the Strange and Complex person has also watched Northern Ballet and has noted, well, it's interesting that in both cases the performer does it, and in both cases the performer does it topless. So that sort of that repressed notion of the pleasure and the queerness and the desire in seeing the male performer's body is made really explicit here. We're not as repressed as Harker was. And I'm conscious these adaptations are well after we've challenged some of the notions that are in Dracula. But what Strange and Complex says is it's really also about showing off the strength. And as part of my, I'm going to go real interdisciplinary with this, I did try and crawl head first down my stairs yesterday, just to see how hard it was. And I tried it, and then I went, I'm not going to do this because my husband's going to find me with a broken neck at the bottom of the stairs, and then he's inevitably going to be tried by the police because he's the most likely person to kill me. And this just seems ridiculous. But yeah, I can assure you, it's really hard. I then went to the bottom of the stairs and tried again. And you have to have a lot of upper body strength. I will just show you some of the wolfishness that we see in Mark Bruce's company. I'll just very briefly show you that again. I think it's only a few seconds. I won't talk over it so that it can be cut out if necessary. So you can see that the performers take on that role of animality. You can't get horses and wolves on stage, so you're going to dress as animal. And arguably, there is sort of a double bind here, in the sense you could state that in acting as an animal, they are showing off the immense control that is required by the body in order to do animal-like behaviors. And much as one could say that the werewolves on the stage in Ballet de la Nuit just simply reiterated the monarch's power in controlling unrest and what's happening, and that somehow the werewolf on stage is a tamed werewolf, like an animal in menagerie. I do want to go a little bit further with this. And what I want to think about perhaps is how, and this is where it gets real methodological, so bear with me, I won't read all of this, it's a bit complicated, how potentially the idea of opening up the possibility that the animal can dance, but the human can also dance like animal, and in doing so break down the binary between human and animal is there. I found Roberto Martinezzi's Zoomimesis quite useful here. He talks about this leaning out into the unknown, and that made me think of Dracula leaning out the window. An unknown dimension becomes a vertigo, and the transition cannot be made without the intervention of an alterity. So you need that otherness, in this case, animal otherness. And I don't want to say that as a using the animal, as in I need it, I'm going to use it as an object, but rather you need to sort of lean into that fearful unknown space where we see an animal and we are not sure to what degree it is like or unlike us. Similar to the way that I would argue that Ellen Welsh talks about that interdependence of the performer and the performance, and that actually it's not a simple supplication by the performer. So too, I would say here that Marchesini is showing us this idea that we need to create, in order to build this dialectic, a hybridizing process capable of opening new epistemic dimensions is indispensable. In art, we recognize such a linking process in the relation between the beautiful, stability, and the sublime, unknown. Very Edmund Burke. And here I think this is where dance has this potential, that trying to be like an animal potentially asks us to think physically through the body what being animal truly is. And thus these breaks of animality into these Gothic dance performances, much like the Gothic at its most revolutionary, can make us question some of the social structures around us. I think this break of animality through embodied practice is a space there. And Hollis Taylor certainly says that we would be overcoming the limitations of human exceptionalism and analytical frameworks and allowing for the possibility of animal dance, and that this will be fruitful for probing the biological basis of artistic practice and investigating existing and new theories of cognition. So I'm going to leave it kind of there. I haven't entirely got a conclusion yet. Any thoughts much appreciated. And yes, at some point I am going to be looking at Howling 3, but I think there's something here about the notion of performance as animal. Okay, I will stop sharing.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Kaja. That's not a hard act to follow at all. I am Dr. Karen Graham. I work at the University of Strathclyde, and also, like Kaja, this paper was a paper based on one that I gave at the International Gothic Association a couple of years ago. I clearly intended to write an image description of this image on my first slide that I never quite managed to get round to. That is the poster from the Northern Ballet's Dracula that you can see on there. So I am going to be taking us kind of forward from some of the historic stuff that Kaja has been talking about, and look at music and the Gothic interruption in contemporary ballet. But to give you a little bit of background on kind of Gothic ballet and where the kind of the project has come from. This as Ballet Gothic kind of as a research project started as all really solid research projects do, as a rant thread on Twitter, and I've given kind of a few presentations on Gothic ballet since this rant thread occurred, and including a previous lecture for Romancing the Gothic. So this might be quite a familiar introduction to some people. You might have heard me talk about this before, but I will kind of condense it, and we can get on to some more interesting stuff. But this Twitter rant, or rather research project idea, came from my attendance at a touring performance of Swan Lake, possibly the most famous ballet of all time. There are two versions, if you didn't know, of the ending of Swan Lake. The traditional ending, where the prince doesn't save Odette, she dies in the end, and the romantic version, where Rothbart, where the prince defeats Rothbart, and the Odette and the prince live happily ever after. This production, unbeknownst to me before I went, was the romantic version, and I was not happy. Hashtag. Naturally, I took to Twitter, and one thread later, we've all ended up here today. And this personal reflection on my own kind of embodied experience as both an amateur dancer, which is what you can see from the screenshot of tweet, which says, and everything about the physical strain ballet engenders is pure body horror. Ask me about my mutilated feet with extra bones. Don't. So this, as well as observations from my family trips to the Nutcracker or Swan Lake, is something that I'm trying to include in my talks and writing about Gothic ballet, because this research project is very different for me from my other research projects. It feels more like a reflection of embodied research, and I think this leads on from what Kaja was talking about, and something more of a personal reflective practice than my other work does. It occurred to me that up until I started this kind of research, my academic endeavours were very much kind of separate from my creative outlet through dance. And this research project is therefore a very personal one, and my approach to it, rightly so, personal and embodied. We have come a long way since my first presentation on the concept at Reimagining the Gothic in 2019. The Reimagining Gothic, and even my last lecture on this for Romancing the Gothic. Googling Gothic ballet back then didn't give you much more than dodgy clip art images of goth girls in tutus and the video for Helena by My Chemical Romance. Now it throws up a lot more relevant results. Who knew you could hire Gothic ballerinas? But thinking about that, I'm not going to kind of rehash what I've talked about before, but instead kind of expand on what I've done. So if you did come to my talk before, you are going to hear some different and kind of extended reflections on ballet Gothic. And so I'm expanding my analysis to examine kind of the impact that scoring the Gothic ballet has on our experience of it. And in that sentence, I used two different but related terms that have emerged and are beginning to kind of solidify in my research on this topic, and that's Gothic ballet and ballet Gothic. Same words, different order. So I've kind of tried to come up with something of a definition into what I'm doing when I use those differently, because I don't necessarily interchange them, but I do use them both. So this is my first attempt. So Gothic ballet, a performance that utilises Gothic elements of narrative and or style, either an adaptation of a Gothic text or an existing ballet adapted to include a Gothic element, versus ballet Gothic, the inherent Gothicness of ballet as an art form due to the uncanny bodies it produces and performs. Movement in ballet is so extremely contranatural that it constitutes as body Gothic. And that's more of kind of my last talk on this. So am I arguing that all ballet is in some sense Gothic, but not all ballets are Gothic ballets? Today I'm going to look at 4 ballets, which is quite a lot to get through in a short period of time. But we're going to be looking at David Nixon's Dracula for Northern Ballet, which originally opened in 2014, but was later broadcast on BBC4 in 2019 as part of their Culture in Lockdown programming. Helen Pickett's The Crucible for Scottish Ballet from 2019, which had its touring production interrupted by lockdown and has only recently been able to have its official world premiere at Sadler Wells in London. Well, that was true 2 years ago. and I missed that sentence. So it had its premiere in Sadler Wells in London a couple of years ago, having stopped in 2019. Corey Baker's Swan Lake, Bath Valley from 2020, which was a short film for the BBC, also as part of their Culture in Lockdown programming, and Paul Lightfoot's Unspoken from 2021, which is a piece created by Lightfoot as a response to his father's death after contracting COVID. So I'm never sure if you can see my mouse, but I do think they're fairly obvious, but the images here are stills from the four valleys. You can see the three brides of Dracula there with Jonathan. Below that is the crucible of the girls dancing with shadow puppets. Just next to the Dracula one, the Bath, funnily enough, is the Bath Valley, and then below that is Paul Lightfoot's Unspoken. Got a bit far. Within these texts, there are kind of two main approaches to scoring the Gothic ballet. And the first can be seen in texts like Nixon's Dracula and Baker's Bath Ballet, where an existing score or collection of pieces is used and the choreography designed to fit around it. This is also the approach that Matthew Bourne uses in his Gothic romance adaptation of Sleeping Beauty, which was on the BBC iPlayer over Christmas. And might still be there if you want to check that out. It's a very interesting piece. The second approach is where an original score is written along with the choreography, such as for Pickett's The Crucible. Both of these approaches wrestle with music as a mechanism by which the Gothic interrupts the traditional ballet ideal, either by highlighting the Gothic undertone of existing classical compositions or creating new pieces to capture it. So today I'm going to compare these approaches, beginning with Dracula and The Crucible, which were created and performed pre-COVID, and ending with two pieces created and filmed post-COVID. Having come at Gothic ballet from a kind of personal reflective approach, I was very aware that I lacked something of a theoretical framework, particularly in considering the musical aspect of these Gothic ballets. I'm familiar enough with the separate theories of both Gothic and dance and performance to apply these kind of in tandem to what I am calling, for lack of any better way to describe them, texts, because they're ballets, films, short pieces. But Gothic music as a whole, different thing. Twitter and many Gothic colleagues came to my rescue again. So please have the apparently mandatory reference to Isabella Van Elfrin's Gothic music. So Van Elfrin's talks about music and the Gothic in a relatively recent publication, but this was kind of the quote that I thought kind of was a really good one to hang my framework on here. So as a gateway to Gothic spectrality, Gothic music enables listeners to experience a time that is off its hinges, and with that, a being that might be haunted, infinite, or simply unknowable. Gothic music is a journey into the uncanny. While I agree with some of my fellow Gothicists who've discussed Van Elfrin's work as kind of falling into the trap of arguing that all music is in some way Gothic, and something that I am conscious I've kind of done with ballet Gothic, an assertion that Gothic music is both linked to spectrality and as temporally discombobulating for the listener is an extremely useful starting point for thinking about Gothic music and Gothic movement together as a journey into the uncanny. Gothic music is, like Gothic ballet, an embodied encounter. Van Elfrin goes on to argue that dance as a participatory cultural practice endorses musical experience that is embodied as well as mental. And while she's talking here about club culture and the goth rave rather than a choreographed performance, I do think that this extends well to a more structured movement. And my first thoughts on reading this were of this quote from Van Elfrin. First things that came to my mind was the blood rave from the opening of Blade. And I did mention that the first time I gave this talk. But since then, think a better example is merged. I'm going to play this now. So I do think this is a very good example to use for what Van Elfren is kind of talking about there. I don't want to say too much about this clip because I have promised the Ghoul Guides that I would talk about this the next time we did, but it is very interesting if you watch interviews of Jenna Ortega when she talks about where she got the inspiration to kind of come up with that choreography herself for that scene, and how she talks about it. And I think versus how it comes across, because I have a very different kind of view of that one, but very much goth music in that setting, and the uncanny movement as being something that is attached to that. So, as I mentioned, the works I'm looking at today fall into two lots of cross-cutting categories. We have two works that are pre-pandemic and two that are post. Two that repurpose existing pieces for new choreography, and two that are composed specifically for the piece. I'm going to go through each in turn with some observations. A bit like Kaja before me, I'm not really going to be delivering a lot in the way of conclusions because I'm still exploring what conclusions we can draw from these observations. And so really looking forward to any questions where there's any kind of input from yourselves on that. So I'm going to start with Dracula. These are the four that fall into the different categories. Sorry, just to explain. So Dracula and The Crucible are two pre-pandemic, and Bath Ballet and Unspoken are two post. And what I mean by cross-cutting categories, which might have made sense if I'd showed you this slide first, is that Dracula pre-COVID utilizes the existing scores from a variety of different composers. Whereas The Crucible, also pre-pandemic, is an original score. And then we have a kind of mirror of that with the with the post-COVID, I don't like post-COVID, with the during COVID performances. So Swan Lake, the Bath Ballet obviously uses existing score from Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky, but Unspoken was that original piece, which was composed by Alexander Mackenzie. So I'm not going to start playing this just yet. I'm going to talk for a little bit. Nixon's music for Dracula is quintessentially uncanny music, with a bricolage of existing classical pieces pulled together to create a score. He primarily chooses works from Soviet composer, I apologize for my pronunciation, Alfred Schnittke, whose signature polystylism is characterized by dark and dissonant passages. Far from easily listening, it could nonetheless be argued that atonal resonance of the works chosen by Nixon are softened by the addition of movement. As the two work in tandem, with sound inspiring movement, movement reacting to sound, they begin to form a new singular piece. Listening to Schnittke's works in their own is frankly difficult. The pieces are challenging, and the composer's polystylism, while similar to that of more popular composers like Shostakovich, are not as successful. But for a foundation from which to build this adaptation and depict the movement of the vampire and the human in contrast, their pieces are in some ways perfect. So I want to look at Dracula and Luce's Pas de Deux, and then the reprise of that. So I'm going to play this. I'm going to skip to the first Pas de Deux. If you want to pause down. So that's the kind of original opening of that Pas de Deux. And what you can see there is that the music is it's very atmospheric. It is what I would say is quintessentially Gothic music. And the choreography is very much kind of well timed with the music. What you can see in Lucy's movement there is that the music and her movement coupled with the dry ice on stage makes it look like she is floating. Lucy is already partly transforming into vampire at this point. And it is interesting to see Lucy do that upside down cross movement, which kind of evokes something of the movement of Dracula that Kaja was talking about. And so we're going to look at the reprise now, slightly later on. And I could just sit and watch it all day, but I will keep going. I think the difference between those two pieces and the movement really fits the story. And you see Lucy being significantly more kind of animalistic now that we are further on down her transition. And it's significantly less seductive and more of a fight between the two of them. And I revisited this text after I put this in my abstract for the conference I presented it at. And in doing so, I kind of found my original assumptions that I made when writing that abstract were really challenged. I was ready to make the argument that this bricolage approach was somehow less effective, or should that be affective, and less successful than the alternative. On kind of reviewing it with a more critical eye, I found that Nixon's approach worked really well, and that with the exception of kind of the staking of Lucy, the familiarity of the music didn't overwhelm the choreography or the narrative. The end fight scene is particularly evocative, with Dixon using a piece from American composer Michael Dougherty's Metropolis Symphony, a composition inspired by a very different literary text, the Superman comics. Fittingly, the final scene is where Nixon diverges most from the parent text, the adapted novel, bringing back the Brides of Dracula for the kind of big fight scene, but also changing Mina's ending. And a spoiler alert, by having her die by suicide after the Count is defeated. I'm going to skip to that and play just a tiny little bit of it. Being kind of aware of my time, I'm going to move on now. I will share the slides afterwards, so if you want to watch this yourself afterwards, do give it a look. So kind of in contrast to Dracula, Pigot's The Crucible has an original score composed by, somewhat ironically, a composer called Peter Salem. Salem is more known as a composer for TV, with his headline credit on Google being for Call the Midwife. The score is modern, utilising a number of non-musical sounds built into it, including screams from the dancers on stage, clock ticks, and church bells. Salem's score epitomises Will Connor's assertion in his article Performing the Sounds of Darkness, an exploratory discussion of musical instruments and the Gothic aesthetic, that Gothic music is made through experimental instrumentation, particularly by making sound from objects formed into or utilised for instruments, as Salem does with a car spring struck with a hammer when the girls point out the witches on stage. This is just the trailer for The Crucible to give you kind of a flavour of the movement. There's no available recording of The Crucible. I went to see it performed live pre-pandemic. It is excellent if at any point you get to it, it tours near you, or a recording becomes available. I really recommend it. Unlike Dracula, where choreography led musical choice, Pigot and Salem worked in tandem with movement and music conceptualized together, going back and forward from choreography and score. And this is a kind of behind the scenes for World Ballet. This gives you a little bit more of a feel for the movement, just since I couldn't get any other recordings. But moving on to see, this is what Salem says about the score. Helen and I spent a lot of time discussing ideas via email before she started choreographing. It was important to me to find out what was inside her head. We tried out a few musical versions for the scene with the girls dancing in the forest. Helen had the idea of using an electronic track to reflect the teenagers and their sexuality. Then we tried a more natural version to give a sense of a connection to nature and the forest. In the end, we went back to the electronic idea and kept some of the natural elements. You can still hear animal sounds, rustling sounds, along with the electronic music. My library of sounds now include many more wind and forest sounds thanks to the Crucible. I didn't realise how often he said sounds there. Excuse me. These electronic elements combine with the non-diegetic forest sounds, ticks, whooshes, and screams to induce an uncanny effect in the viewer or listener. This juxtaposition of a modern soundscape in a historical setting does a lot of the work in invoking the Gothic for the text. Both ballets, Dracula and The Crucible, regardless of musical origin, deploy some of the same stylistic conventions in the process of adapting these Gothic texts into Gothic ballets. For example, in Dracula, the human women are on point, but the vampire women are not. We see this first with the three brides, contrasted to Jonathan's daydream of Mina. It's later the indicator for Lucy's and subsequently Mina's transformations into vampire. In an almost identical move, the women and girls of the Crucible are all on point until they are accused of witchcraft, after which they are stripped of their point shoes in a similar way to their branding as witches. I have no real conclusions, but it's interesting the implication is that purity is on point, but monstrosity is not. But that only is kind of relational to the female dancers. For Swan Lake, the Bath Ballet, Corey Baker choreographed 27 dancers remotely to Tchaikovsky's famous Swan theme at the height of lockdown. Filmed mainly on iPhones, the dancers perform in a variety of bathtubs. That sounds entertaining and also perhaps a little humorous. A Swan Lake where the lake is replaced by a bathtub. Visually, though, it's much more Gothic than that, luckily for me. So I'm going to play a quick clip from this.
Muted.
Sorry to cut that a little bit short, but it is available on YouTube if you want to go and see the whole thing. That gives you enough of a flavour to know what I'm about to talk about. So disembodied limbs emerge from the bath, bent at backwards angles to mimic the neck of a swan. A dancer erupts, panting from underneath a pile of feathers. The screen splits to show multiple identical dancers side by side. Sometimes it is a duplicate, sometimes a doppelganger, in water that is artificially blue. Things get more surreal as the film progresses until we reach the climax where a ballerina in a full white swan costume emerges and then disappears into an antique bath. The film is a disturbingly accurate metaphor for the emotional and physical restriction of life in lockdown. All of our vast lakes transformed into bathtubs, connected to most of the outside world only through our phones, putting the bin out wearing a ball gown. Rewatching Baker's piece for this, I found myself reflecting on lockdown and that most Gothic interruption to our lives. The space the dancers have is too small, the music and movement too big for its surroundings. The restriction pushes the human body to split into doubles or severed parts, still moving but no longer whole. And in all of this, Tchaikovsky's Swan theme marches on in the background, an incongruity of comforting familiarity against the uncanny movement of the swans. Paul Lightfoot's Unspoken, my last piece, is subtitled A Funeral Through Dance. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2021, and the short film opens with the audio from a voicemail playing over a tracking shot of the vaulted ceiling and nave of Grundtvigs Church in Copenhagen. The audio is Lightfoot's mother asking him to come home. Paul, it's Mum. You really need to get back home. Dad's not well. As the film continues, we learn that his father passes away, with the choreographer unable to say goodbye due to the COVID restrictions in the hospital. The same, nevertheless tragic story to millions of other families. Lightfoot gives body, rather than voice, to this bubbling trauma in the aftermath of the Worlds. The documentary that precedes the choreographed piece and shows some of Lightfoot's creative processes over Zoom working with dancer and Sebastian Haynes. I'll do it very, very, very short. Muted. Sorry. I'm sorry to cut that short, but I'm aware that you're waiting on Kate. Writing on this piece has been difficult, and I feel reluctant to try and quantify what Lightfoot's doing here. Pianist Alexander Mackenzie's original work, composed with Lightfoot and Haynes over Zoom, it's very traditional, cresting and falling with waves of intricate runs breaking into sections that are only just in the range of hearing. It has a magical effect. We rise and fall with it, our breath shortening like the people we are saying goodbye to. Haynes' movement is balletic, but not quite ballet. He's part contortionist, and at times seems to defy gravity itself. While the other pieces I've discussed deal with the Gothic interruption in the moment, Lightfoot's piece goes beyond the moment of trauma into what comes after. And that's as much of a conclusion as I have.
Right, so this is part 3 of today's talk, so thank you very much for bearing with. This one's slightly shorter, so I'll just rattle through it and then we can go into the Q&A section. So this paper will be looking at how injury interrupts the careers of ballet dancers. Generally, this will be physical injury. So there's some horrific descriptions later on if anyone gets particularly squeamish about snapped tendons. But I will touch upon mental and social issues that can be argued, if not an injury of sorts, then certainly an interruption. The Twitter handle for our project is up there. Please give it a follow if you don't already do so. Browse the hashtag BalletGothic to have a look at some of the things we've done so far as well. Also check out the hashtag 31 Days of Macabre Dance for our Halloween tweet editions. There's some interesting things in there. So to begin, I want to show you the delightfully Gothic opening credits of the Star's 10-episode series Flesh and Bone. So the opening credits of Flesh and Bone play on the ideas of surface beauty and underlying trauma. So the cuts from the ballerina to the X-ray flashes of the ballet skeleton shows the physical toll that ballet takes on the body. What the ballerina projects during performance is poise, control, and grace in each movement, but we are given a voyeuristic view of reality. These images are at once intimate and clinical. The stresses put on the body from ballet are a biological certainty, like any form of movement, yet the rigorous upkeep of the illusion of effortlessness is undercut by the audience literally being able to see beneath the skin surface. However, these are just flashes. The illusion returns, and although we are aware that there are injuries or risks to the body, we allow ourselves to be immersed back into the reality the dancer wishes us to see. So the most common injury in ballet is that to the feet caused by point shoes. Most, if not all, ballet media in the 21st century show the mutilated feet of dancers, as you can see from these stills on the left from Netflix 2020 series Tiny Pretty Things, showing one of the main characters, Bet, trying to mask the severity of her injury, and from Darren Aronofsky's 2010 piece Black Swan, where protagonist Nina tapes up her foot in between practice sessions. As Anne Cooper Albright says in her article, The Perverse Satisfaction with Gravity, quote, "The ultimate illusion, of course, is that of a perfect dancing body, one completely unhampered by sweat, pain, or the evidence of any physical negotiation with gravity." As in most cases, this type of injury is danced through. The dancer removes toenails, tapes up her toes, and then in effect hides the injury by putting the shoe back on. Out of sight, out of mind. The illusion of the perfect dancing body must be maintained throughout. This, of course, is not a modern phenomenon. Edgar Degas was famed for his impressionist works of ballerinas, either preparing to go on stage or during a performance. However, this work from circa 1879, entitled Two Dancers, seems to show fatigue. The dancer on the left is bent over as if composing herself with pained legs, and the other appears to be stretching, yet could also be checking her left ankle for injury due to the fact she is seated on a bench rather than the floor. This, of course, being Paris, these dancers would have been expected to return to the stage and show nothing but perfection. The inclusion of the breaking and moulding of the point shoe is a common motif in ballet, film, and TV, from Centre Stage to Black Swan, as it is a metaphor for how a dancer is broken and moulded into shape, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It is also the theme of the Dust Jacket tagline for the 2021 novel that I'll be discussing later in the paper, The Ballerinas by Rachel Capelpi-Dale. Quote, ballerinas are like point shoes. You have to break them down before they're of any use. It also calls up the idea of the career of the dancer being short and perilous. What may be little known to the general public is that a pair of point shoes will only usually last one performance, if not all the way through, depending on the role. This magnifies the sense of urgency that you may only be one performance away from being replaced. Going back then to the Flesh and Bone credits, the juxtaposition of the delicacy and soft femininity of the ballet foot and shoe with the sexualized leather boot of the pole dancer. Here, there is no flash of what is beneath. Within the context of the series, it gives rise to the idea that the ballet world inflicts more trauma than that of the exotic dancer. That the strength of owning one's sexuality gives a power to the dancer's body that ballet is lacking. The differing durability of the pole dancer's shoe also suggests that the career as an exotic dancer, while it does not carry the prestige of a ballet dancer, has longevity and is lucrative in a way ballet is not. Pole dancing in Flesh and Bone is used as a supplementary income to the meagre wage of the ballet dancer. The sense that youth and beauty is highly valued in ballet is certainly set against the broader range of taste for exotic dancers. This can be seen in the 2019 film Hustlers, which showcases a 50-year-old Jennifer Lopez in character as Ramona, an athletic, talented, and still desirable exotic dancer, which in turn inspired her Super Bowl performance in 2020. And in all three of the examples in this paper, Flesh and Bone, Tiny Pretty Things, and the Ballerinas, all the former dancers have been relegated to strictly admin roles. The prima ballerina in Flesh and Bone is Kira, played by Ukrainian ballet dancer Irina Dovrenko, whom we learn has an ongoing foot injury, as seen in this clip here. Kira knows her position as prima relies on her ability to continue to dance to a previous standard, and so she downplays her injury, going to her bohemian friend Jasper, who supplies her with drugs to numb the pain. As the series progresses, Kira becomes increasingly threatened by Claire, the newest member of the ballet company, who displays enough talent to replace her, and so she escalates her need with Jasper, as we can see here. Kira wants Jasper to inject her foot with bivacapine, that drug that I can't pronounce. But he warns her, quote, "You should shatter your peroneus and never feel a thing," end quote, and refuses to do it. She begs him by attempting to seduce him, an act which he's disgusted by, but he tells her where to inject her foot and gives her the drug, telling her, quote, "I'm handing you the gun, don't ask me to pull the trigger," end quote. Kira is given the means to temporarily keep her career intact, yet she is plagued by other people doubting her ability. When Paul, the sadistic company director, tries to talk her into giving Claire the part in the second performance, Kira explodes at him, quote, 10 years I give you, my life, this body. Who were you before me? Nothing. A joke. Has been. A fucking busboy with a bad back and a rich boyfriend. I give you perfection. You need transcendence. I give you every performance, the best transcendence. You made this company, but I'm the one who made you. Kira acknowledges herself as a commodity, that her body is something that has been effectively sold and used to create a successful product. Yet she is also keenly aware of her own career mortality. And while the audience has not explicitly told her age, we can infer that she's been 10 years as prima, with her rise to her position before that, and so is regarded as being of retirement age, in the sense of a ballet dancer. Her identity, then, is called into question. If not a ballet dancer, if not prima, then who is she? She's returned to a state of woman. And in a previous episode, we can see there is an implication that to be woman means a state of usefulness. As woman, she is expected to have children. In dialogue from episode 5, Jasper comments that Kira is, quote, a serval in an emerald collar. He means that he views her as a wild thing that has been domesticated and paraded on display for her beauty and exoticism. Kira replies, quote, I'm not an animal. To which Jasper retorts, quote, darling, Prescott, who is her husband, is just waiting for you to retire so he can breed you like one. Kira's own thoughts on becoming a mother are not really allowed to be given a voice. It is expected that come her retirement from ballet, she will assume this new role without question. This idea will also be touched on when I look at the novel The Ballerinas later in the paper. So moving on to Netflix series Tiny Pretty Things. The idea of agency and control as a ballet dancer is shown in the promotional material. As you can see here, point shoes are hanging like marionettes, and the imagery is echoed in the second episode when one of the dancers tells Nevaeh, who is the main character, newly arrived at the ballet school to replace soloist Cassie Shore, who's had a mysterious fall from the roof of the academy and is now in a coma. Very teen drama. Nevaeh is told, quote, "You need to think like a puppet. Our ballet master is the brain, you're just the body." There is a recurring theme throughout the series of the dancers being mere puppets and reduced to their dance skills alone. Now, the series falls short and is problematic in many, many, many ways. But one aspect that's interesting is the use of dream sequences and how they relate to the fear of physical injury. So the bottom image shows the aforementioned Bette seeing herself dead, laid out on a platter naked and surrounded by fruit, and watches as she is cannibalized by her fellow dancers. This shows Bette's underlying fear that her foot injury will hamper her progress and that she will literally be eaten alive by her rivals. The top image is of Nevaeh, who dreams she is in Cassie's hospital bed, and the sheets are pulled back to reveal a crude amputation. We later learn that her brother has been paralyzed in an accident, and so it plays on a familial fear that leg paralysis could also happen to her and she would no longer be able to dance. As the center picture shows, Oren, one of the male dancers that's shown to be struggling with an eating disorder, which is one of the few depictions of a man having a condition with what is seen as a traditionally female concern, particularly when it comes to the ballet movie. And arguably, this is one aspect that the series does well. So in one voiceover, Nevaeh comments, quote, "You find the perfect torture to get results without busting up the machine that got you this far." And we see this with Oren. He has a journal that he religiously calorie counts and administers himself through, and we frequently see him perform acts of self-hatred. There is one scene where he's donned heavy clothing and is jogging in the sauna to try and lose weight. Other male dancers commenting on being a fatso, and so in his dream sequence, he wakes up in a sweat after having imagined his skin being unzipped from his body, literally having layers removed to become more perfect. Now, to touch briefly on the novel The Ballerinas by Rachel Kapelke-Dale. Largely, the novel concerns itself with the ideas of the aging body, the ballerina coming to the end of her career, and how being viewed as a body their whole lives has had a detrimental effect on their mental health. The narrator, Delphine, has returned to Paris after having spent 10 years in Russia working as a choreographer, and she comments on how much pain ballerinas suffer. Quote, "I watch their pink satin feet and I know. Underneath those shoes, the flesh is exposed, has been rubbed down into multi-layered wounds. Beneath the pink glossy tights, they ache to the marrow of their bones." She admits that she gets a perverse sense of satisfaction by having power over these bodies, and that these wounds are created because they are dancing her choreography. These wounds of others almost belong to her. Kapelke-Dale's ballerinas are angry, and this anger keeps threatening to make its way to the surface, which it inevitably does at the end of the novel. As Delphine tries to contain this anger, she is attempted to be manipulated by her friend Lindsay's husband as an ally to pressure Lindsay to give up her career as a dancer in order to have children. Quote, "Do you want children, Delphine?" I open my mouth, about to give my standard answer, someday, maybe, with the right man. But then the audacity of the question registered, exploding inside me. Blonde or brunette, spit or swallow, virgin or whore. Men are always trying to get us to pick a camp, to declare our allegiance, to reveal what kind of woman we are, so that they can judge whether we're doing it right. This leads to the climax of the novel, where there's an act of violence that will effectively end the career of Lindsay by her husband. And spoiler alert, Delphine's rage can no longer be contained, and she pushes him out the window and kills him. So this act is the culmination of the underlying theme of the novel. Quote, "Everyone has an opinion about our bodies. Everyone always does. They think about and talk about our bodies like we belong to anybody and everyone but ourselves." When it comes to ballet and the Gothic, the real-life experiences of injured dancers are always in the wings of the fictional dramatizations. Take these two examples. Jade Hale Christophe describes an injury where his hamstring ripped from his pelvis, and that of Missy Copeland, who fractured her leg during her debut in Firebird. As Hale Christophe describes in an interview for The Guardian in 2010, quote, "At ballet school, I tore my hamstring off my pelvis when I was in the splits. I heard it rip. You know straight away when it's serious, but I didn't want to embarrass myself, so I finished the rehearsal. It took 4 months to heal. I couldn't walk for 2 weeks until the muscle reattached itself. Then I spent a month in bed." And as Missy Copeland describes her injury in a 2018 Cosmopolitan interview, quote, "I ended up having surgery on my left tibia and having a plate screwed in. I had 6 fractures and I was told I would never dance again." So these cases show the injury, while medically horrific, also introduces the fear of the recovery or lack thereof. Generally, this means a temporary retirement while the healing process takes place. But in the case of Stephen McRae, principal dancer with the Royal Ballet London, he has embraced his injury. So McRae snapped his Achilles tendon during a performance of Manon and has done multiple interviews since describing the injury and the subsequent recovery process. From this interview for People in 2021, he does not hold back from the visceral reality. Quote, where it had snapped and ricocheted up my leg, it looked like someone had bitten a chunk out of my tights. The surgeon had to go into my lower leg and pull the Achilles back down, clean it up, and then reattach it. 2 little bungee straps were inserted to support it. The photography feature Gramigliano in 2016 shows him with a boot on, rather than waiting until he was fully healed. An interesting aesthetic choice, which seems chosen to break down barriers of the idea of the perfect dancer body. He posted on his own Instagram when he was able to return to performing a Gran Allegro and barrel jumps, using the terminology of having a bionic Achilles. McRae acknowledges the medical adaptations that have been made to his body and is grateful that it allows him to return to his passion. Yet ironically, he played the role of the creature in Liam Scarlett's Frankenstein, so there's a wonderful blurring of art and reality there. And so while McRae is attempting to break down barriers with regards to how a male ballet dancer is perceived, he is currently in the filming process of a documentary called The Resilient Man, but it has to be addressed how much ballet is very much a white space. Ballet Black, a London-based company, was created by Casa Pancho specifically to carve out a space for dancers who are Black and Asian. She was interviewed for an article in the Imperial Society of Teachers of Dancing and explained why this was necessary. Quote, in the early days, a lot of people wouldn't say they didn't understand why we need a Ballet Black. What's the point and what's the purpose? But when you ask them how many Black women are in UK ballet companies, they couldn't come up with an answer. It really made people have to think about it, whereas before they may not have considered it at all. So I hope that at the very least by provoking the discussion, we've had an impact. Pancho trained at the Royal Academy of Dance, but a back injury set her career back 2 years. Her dissertation from Durham University addressed the lack of Black dancers, and although Ballet Black was formed in 2001, it has taken until 2019 to create a ballet shoe that matches the skin colour of a Black or Asian dancer. Created with then principal dancer Kira Robinson and Freed of London, it has allowed a huge door to be opened for young dancers. Kira Robinson also performed with fellow Ballet Black dancer Muthaleli November as part of Stormzy's Glastonbury set the same year, further displaying that ballet can reach a wider audience when the narrow established parameters are broadened, which sounds as painfully obvious as it is, and yet has still taken so much effort to put into place. Ballet norms are determined to stay rigid. Ballet and Blackness also become symbolic in the Black Lives Matter protest in Richmond, Virginia, as shown by this viral photograph taken by Julia Rendelman. Ballet is placed within the realm of Black joy, that the Black body, particularly that the Black female body, can inhabit this traditionally white space and succeed in it. To conclude then, I would argue that the ballerina can be viewed as a final girl of sorts. As Jack Halberstam quotes in Skin Show's Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, quote, the final girl is, according to Clover, the survivor, the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and of her own peril, who is chased, cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. While perhaps not horror in the traditional sense of the slasher movie, the same theory can be applied. The final girl in ballet witnesses bodily mutilation, both her own and those around her. She is pursued by predatory men, those wanting to use her body for her own ends, be it for sexual reasons or capitalist gains. She is faced with tough decisions, that of her own career, be it at the expense of those who came before, those around her, or her own morals. We bear witness to her struggles, her wounds, we see her fall and rise again, and we see her scream against the patriarchal injustice of it all. The nemesis in these examples is not one villain in particular, but the system in which the ballet world inhabits. The final girl is at the moment just another role, cyclical like a ballet season, and needs a new choreography to interrupt it. Thank you.